I am Amy Murray from Teaching Exceptional Kinders. I am in South Central Pennsylvania, not far from Hershey. That's not technically where I live, but most people have heard of Hershey instead of the town where I am. Oh, fun! There's another Amy teaching kindergarten in Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking all about getting your beginning writers, especially kindergartners, to write complete sentences, which can feel like pulling teeth, right? Or like you're pulling your hair out trying to figure this out. So let's get started. All right, a little bit about me. I spent 12 years in the classroom, and then you'll see the breakdown there, 4 in special education and 9 in kindergarten. Yes, I know that is 13, but 1 year overlapped. So I taught learning support in the morning and kindergarten in the afternoon because they had a last minute need for a half day where I taught and where I live, it's half day kindergarten. So they had a last minute need for kindergarten and they picked me. And I fell in love with kindergarten and never looked back. So throughout the years, I've been letters trained and OG trained. I was actually OG trained in college because my student teaching placement was doing foundations and they trained us, which is awesome. And then letters training the last few years of teaching when I was in the classroom. And I left the classroom 2020-ish, somewhere around there, because my kiddos were reaching the age where we had half-day kindergarten. I didn't know what I was going to do with her and all of that. And so now I get to create time-saving, simple resources for kindergarten teachers and share what worked for me in the classroom and hopefully what will work for you too. All right. Thanks everyone for saying hi. It's so nice to know I'm not just talking to myself. All right, let me shrink my head here. That sounded weird, but you see what I mean. There we go. So you can see the slides. Okay, so writing is likely the hardest thing you will ever ask your students to do because they have to take everything they know, right? All their phonics knowledge, all their fine motor skills, their handwriting, how to even make the letters, how to get them on the paper. It's a big deal at the beginning of kindergarten, at least. Hopefully by now, most of your kiddos are okay with that part. And then they've got to get all of that plus an idea that actually makes sense onto paper. It's just a lot of processing. And likely you've heard kids say, it's too hard, I'm not doing it. They will shut down. They will maybe even throw a full tantrum, been there, because they just perceive it as too difficult. And I think a lot of times it stems from the expectations that are put on us as teachers that we pass on to them, which just isn't developmentally fair or appropriate. So I'm thinking back to the beginning of my kindergarten teaching, which, like I said, was probably about 15 years ago. And all of a sudden, we had these expectations that kids were to write a full paragraph, not by the end of the year, like mid-year, with a beginning, a middle, an end, all the conventions. It was absolutely crazy, but it was like this top-down thing. They realized their writing scores were low, and so then they passed it on to all of us. And it was honestly a nightmare. And on top of all of that, so we have frustrated kids, frustrated teachers because the expectations are impossible. And here we are expecting them to write sentences. And my teammate and I were like, wait, we just need to pump the brakes here. We have to take this back to the very beginning. And we did not have a writing curriculum. And I'm going to put a poll up here. Let us know if you have a writing curriculum. There we go. And like what that might look like for you. So we didn't have a true writing curriculum. Some people used the kid writing program, but I didn't have a manual. So I didn't really know what kid writing was in order to implement it properly. Our big box curriculum was old at that point because we were in a budget shortfall. So they weren't buying us new curriculum, of course. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. So they weren't buying us new curriculum, and we were stuck. We were just trying to make it up as we went. And so we had to get back to the basics. Yeah, most of you don't. Here, I'll share. Yep, that's kind of what I figured, because we never did either. Most of you don't have a writing curriculum either. That is not surprising to me, because that was my experience as well. And I'm pretty sure that my daughter, and who is a kindergartner, doesn't have a writing curriculum in her classroom either, which is no one's fault. It's just what it is. So what we did was we took it back to the very beginning, not even sentences yet. We started with alphabetic principles, right? So we needed to make sure, I'm getting ahead of myself here, I think. Yep. Teach the easier skills before sentences. So if they're not ready yet, there's no sense in making them try a sentence. You gotta pull it back a little bit. So we started with, after they knew all their letters and at least how to make them as far as handwriting goes, because you can't expect them to write anything if they can't form the letters yet. And hopefully at this point in the school year, that's not such a problem for you. But then we started with a labeling unit. We spent like 2 weeks, so like 10 days, labeling all the things. So we would use little Post-it notes, not this big, but Post-it notes, and we did a label the teacher lesson. We labeled the classroom. We labeled, and we made it fun, because kids need to experience success so writing doesn't feel as hard, so you can build their confidence. Okay, so that's what I just said. It's important that kids experience that success, so they're more confident in writing, so they're more willing to try something. Because if it's hard immediately, you're going to face that roadblock of they're going to shut down and not even try for you. So you want to solidify those alphabetic principles first. We talked about that. And we started with our labeling unit, and it was fun and engaging in a way that they could experience success in writing early. And then we did a listing unit where we weren't expecting them to write sentences. They just listed like things they need at the grocery store, things they want for their birthday, names of friends, list all the colors you can think of, that kind of thing, just to practice and get some good experience writing. And then we were ready to start talking about sentences. So we spent probably 3 weeks or so just practicing with things, no mentioning of sentences. And then we were ready to start. Using kid-friendly terminology is important for a lot of reasons. I had taught, no, I hadn't. My teammate had taught an upper grade, and she was coming at them and she was like, you need a subject and a predicate and punctuation marks. And they were just like, what are you talking about, woman? And so it's too much. So we took this back to the basics too. And we, so it has to be simple enough for kids to understand. We got that. A sentence definition, right? So we need to understand what a sentence is. Why are we writing it? What is a sentence? And so in my classroom, we used to chant, a sentence is a group of words that tells us something. A sentence is a group of words that tells us something. Why? Well, because they needed to understand that, and maybe you've had this experience where kids just write something on a paper and they'll just write letters, right? And they'll bring it to you and they'll say, what does this say? Well, they needed to understand that when you write, you're writing to tell something. You're not just putting letters down on a paper and hoping that it makes sense. Our point is we're putting words together to tell somebody something. And sometimes they miss that point entirely, and you have to just take it back and explain it. And then we did the parts of a sentence. So every time we wrote, we would say, a sentence is a group of words that tells us something. So they're remembering that part. And then what does a sentence have? A sentence has a naming part. Right? We call that the subject or the nouns. But in the beginning of sentence writing, a naming part will do. Who or what is the sentence about? Who's in it? Or what is in it? And then the telling part, which is your predicate, your verbs, the action, what's happening in the sentence. So like in the sentence, the dog is barking. The dog is the naming part, right? And what's he doing? He's barking. and we would practice with these naming parts and telling parts. And so we would practice with these in the front of the classroom with mentor sentences, example sentences, and pictures to help scaffold that. And then, oh, who and do, I like that, right? So you have your naming part, the who, and what are they doing, the telling part. So practicing with that and giving them opportunities, like here's a sentence starter. I'm going to give you the naming part. You give me the telling part, right? So if I gave them a picture of a dog and it says the dog, then they're going to write what the dog's doing. The dog eats, the dog runs, whatever it is they want to do. But practicing making it make sense so that we're getting words on paper so it makes sense. Okay. And then we would get into conventions. And my biggest advice when talking about the conventions of all of this is taking it step by step and creating some kind of visual for them that they can follow along and check to see if they have all the things they need. But we would really focus like a week at a time, maybe a couple weeks at a time on each of the conventions until I felt like they had a solid thing or a solid understanding. Because what happens is we introduce all of them at once, like you need this, 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 and this, and it's too much. Because like we said at the beginning, it's just a lot to ask 5 and 6-year-olds to remember and to get on to paper. And they'll tell you that, or you can see it in their reactions when you send them to write and they just put their head down or say it's too hard, right? All right, so we focused on capitalization. And yes, I know you need capitals for names and capitals at the beginning, but I don't know about any of you. My kiddos wanted to write in all capitals all the time. And so it was more about getting lowercase letters on their writing paper and then having just the capital at the beginning and starting small and building up. But making sure that we had proper capitalization was important. And after we talked and mastered that, we would move on to punctuation, or I like to call punctuation ending marks, because it shows where your sentence or your ideas end. And that seemed to make the most sense to them, right? Where's your stopping point? Where does that sentence end? Are you using a period? Is it a regular sentence? Are you excited? Are you using your exclamation point? Or did you ask a question? Do you need one of those question marks? But using that ending mark terminology helped them to understand, okay, here's my group of words. I'm done with that sentence. And I put my punctuation mark. Because you probably also had kids who just put a dot, a period at the end of each line of their writing, right? Because they know they need a period, but they don't understand where it goes. So using that ending mark terminology was helpful for them. All right, and then spacing. Spacing, this might be a controversial take, but those cute little spacer sticks, the popsicle sticks that look like astronauts or spacemen or rockets or whatever, adorable. Don't get me wrong. And if they work in your classroom, that's great. Here's the problem. When you send them home, do they have a spacer stick? Do they have access to that outside of your classroom? Do they lose it in your classroom? Because kids lose things. Guess what they won't lose? Their fingers. They're not going anywhere. So you can teach them finger spaces between their words. And that, or after every word. Yes, at least they do. Periods get sprinkled in sort of like confetti when you start to introduce them. But so teaching them ending marks so once they grasp what a sentence is, they'll understand where to put them. All right, so finger spaces between words, because their fingers aren't going anywhere. They always have them. Now, sometimes at the beginning, if your kids are struggling with fine motor and need both hands, one hand to write and one to keep their paper still, then yes, having a third, a pencil, a crayon, a cute, adorable spacer stick is helpful at the beginning. But also teaching them finger spaces is helpful too. Yes, finger spaces and meatball spaces, right? Meatball spaces, spaghetti spaces, noodle spaces between your letters. So small spaces between your letters, and meatball spaces between your words is a cute way to remember how to put your spacing on there too. But in order to have that, like stopping, having that finger, and then they can write right next to it is really helpful. All right, and then our last convention really is spelling. And sorry, I'm sort of in the way there, aren't I? But spelling is a tricky thing in kindergarten, and likely if I asked you guys, you'd be sort of all over the map of what you expect for spelling, what we used to call sight words or high frequency words, or now heart words, or whatever it is you're calling them these days. In my classroom, we held them responsible for the words that we had taught and that they were supposed to know by sight, whatever it is you're calling those, but the ones that they were supposed to be able to read and write. They were supposed to spell correctly. And then we just wanted them to get their sounds, to represent sounds with letters on their paper. So kid spelling or kid writing was perfect, but sounding out the words as best they can, not just stringing together random letters and hoping it was a word. That is what spelling looked like for us. And that just made me think of something, and I totally lost that thought. I will let you know if it comes back to me here. Okay, so I talked about using a checklist for those conventions. Now, this is what we use in the classroom, and that's why it's up here. But you can use any checklist, and you don't have to have 5 things. You can have 3 things. But having a visual with your checklist, I think, is really important. If you have been around teaching exceptional kinders at all, you know I am a huge believer in using visuals for all the things in kindergarten. I mean, like, we had visuals for everything, but also for our writing checklist, because kids can't read all of this yet. And they're not reading capital letter or proper capitalization. So having those letters at the end jogs their memory. Okay, step 1, I need my capital letters. Do I have them? All right, look, there's the finger space picture. Okay, step 2, do I have spaces in my words? Step 3, oh, there's my ending marks. Do I have punctuation at the end of my sentence? And this was our spelling visual that we used. So did I sound out my words correctly? And then our last thing was always, does it make sense? Because we don't want, what does this say? We want them to tell us what it says. Even if it's not spelled properly, at least they had their ideas and they're going back and reading it to make sure that it makes sense to them. Yes, kindergarten spelling, exactly. So giving them the autonomy to spell how the best that they can spell. Now, that's what I was going to say when I talked about spelling. One of the things that makes writing even more challenging in the kindergarten classroom is we probably, if you're anything like me, we had a word wall at the beginning, and then by the end we had our sound wall up around the room. And then we had lists of like color words back here. And we had our high frequency words or sight words, heart words in another spot. And so all these things are all over the room. And the problem with that is, and they serve their purpose, so don't get me wrong, but the problem with that is, as they're looking up all over the room, they have to go find the information they need, right? Then they have to take that information, keep it in here, pick up their pencil, get back to their paper, find where they were writing, and write it down. That is a lot of steps for a 5 or 6-year-old brain. It just is. That's a lot to process. And I don't know what your students are like, what my students were like by the end. That was too much to process at once for most of them. So having some sort of, and I apologize, I didn't make a slide for this, but having some sort of writing folder, writing binder, reference page that sits right in front of them, so they're only looking from here to here instead of all over the room, is super helpful. We used a portable sound wall. So they just had this little file folder that they opened, and it had the vowels and the consonants there, and the spelling patterns were on the cards. And so they could find their sounds and use it that way. There are all different ways that you can create little writing folders or binders, but having something like that for them is very helpful in that processing, because it is a challenge for them to, I don't know, sometimes it's a challenge for me to walk into a classroom that's a little bit more busy and find what I need to use, for lack of a better term, around the classroom. So giving them right in front of them is super helpful. And if you're going to use a checklist, which I highly suggest you have some sort of checklist for them to self-check their writing, and that helps to reinforce that, yes, we're writing sentences, and yes, your sentence needs to have all of these things, that it be somewhere near or on their paper. So you could print out like a small little version of it that they could use, or you can use paper with it directly on the paper, which is what we did. So we did 5-star sentences, and we would stamp little stars for what they had, and they would get so excited about earning all their stars. And it's just something cutesy that helped to keep them engaged and wanting to write and wanting to do it correctly, so they earned their stars. And then we had the pictures right on their paper. So that was helping them to be able to check. They didn't need to read capitalization. They didn't need to read that big punctuation word. The pictures were there for them, and they could just check it off that way, and truly could self-check their work, which makes a big difference when you've got a class full of kids. You can say, did you go do your checklist? Are you sure you have a 5-star sentence on that paper before you bring it to me? And like I said, if you only want to do 3, like maybe you just want to make sure they have capitalization, finger, and punctuation, just do 3 stars, right? And however it is that works best for you. But that way, it's there and they can self-check, which is a big deal. All right, the other key here is scaffolding support for your kids. And now I got to move myself because I'm in the way again. At least this thing lets me move around. There we go. Scaffolding support. So sometimes you have, not sometimes, all the time, you have kids who are ready to go write their sentences independently, right? And probably can go write you a book. You have kids who are really working on just physically getting letters onto paper. And you have kids who are just reluctant writers who are like, I don't know what to write about. I'm not doing it, right? And that was always a struggle for me when we did kid writing, because we didn't all, like, we would give them a topic sometimes, like write about something you did over the weekend. And they would just sit there and be like, I didn't do anything. And I mean, I used to say, well, I know you ate something. I know you slept. I know, you know what I mean? Like those kind of things. So you could at least write about a meal that you had, but that wasn't enough. So sometimes providing a picture for them to write about makes all the difference too. So just scaffolding the support that kids need, and breaking this down into steps is super helpful. And here's what I mean. So you can differentiate assignments. Good grief. There we go. You can differentiate assignments to meet your kids where they are. So I said giving them a picture of some kind, even putting a picture up on the board and telling them to go write about it is helpful. It eliminates that what do I write about? Because clearly here we're going to write about a turtle because there's a turtle on the page. And this one also has a sentence starter. So you already have the turtle, the sea turtle swims in, and all they have to come up with on this page is where they're swimming. So ocean, water, the what. It's very simple. So this one would have like the most support that a student might need, right? And then if you have a kiddo who is having trouble copying from the board onto their paper, or a kiddo with fine motor practice who needs extra fine motor practice, or just forming those letters correctly on the lines, giving them a tracing sentence starter is really helpful for that extra practice as well. And then of course you're going to have kids who are ready for just writing the sentence about the picture, but the picture is there so they can just write a sentence about the picture, and you don't have to hear I don't know what to write about. I can't do it. And all of those whiny excuses that often come with writing time. Um, that's where these activities stem from is I couldn't take it anymore. What do I write about? The beauty of using the same prompt in all these different ways is you can create journals or assignments all about the same topic, but different scaffolded support based on what your students need. And you can even give your high flyers, the ones who are ready to write all on their own, just the blank page and say, go write about whatever the topic is, and they can create their own, or however you want to use that. But you're offering multiple opportunities to practice. And you can use these as your whole group assignments. You can use these in small group. You can use these in like a writing center. You can, but using picture prompts is a powerful way to get kids writing and eliminate a lot of the excuses. We hear those a lot, right? All right, so before we get into the offer that I was going to tell you about, I did promise we would have a CEU certificate. So I will share that now. So you can see up on the right corner of, sorry for my squeaky chair, it's really noisy. Up here in the right corner, CEU certificate, you can click there to download that and fill it in. And hopefully your district will accept that for you. If you have any questions for me, any other questions about how I taught writing or anything like that, go ahead and drop them in the comments now, and we'll talk about those. You can grab that certificate while we're doing the Q&A. And yes, I'll talk more about that checklist in just a second. All right. Anybody have any questions for me? I feel like I need some background music. So yes, once how to explain, oh, that's a good one, Janet. I'll get to that in a second. So Lisa, into other types of writing. So when we started with labeling, right? We built up for that. Then we did our listing. And then once we mastered sentences and sentence writing, or at least had a handle on what a sentence is and could do it independently, then we did move on to different types of writing based on what our state standards expected of the kids. So the state standards had like, I know they just changed recently too. Just the different types of writing, right? They had to do a narrative, persuasive, and all of those things. So yes, then we would move into narrative writing. That was the easiest because they were writing about themselves. And then we would do how-to writings and little animal reports and things like that throughout the year. And I'm actually working on our sentence writing unit right now, which will have like ready to use lesson plans, but it is not quite ready yet. My hope is to get that out by June. And then we'll move on and have our narrative and everything else to go with our listing and labeling unit. How to explain to parents that kindergarten spelling is okay. So we would send home a letter about writing and what writing expectations look like in kindergarten. And it started with, please don't spell words for your student. And here's why. And we would talk just about how we were learning to, we called it kid writing because we did have the kid writing program. And it's okay to misrepresent sounds, but we want them to start learning that sound, that letters represent sounds, and we're putting them on paper to try to build words. And usually that helped. I mean, you're always going to have parents who spell things for their kids. And honestly, I always thought it's not the end of the world for them to see how things are spelled correctly, as long as they're still getting the practice with their sounds and things at school. So that's how we handled it.
And that wraps up our Q&A session. So let's chat about print and use resources you can use right now. This is our year-long picture writing prompt bundle. It has 15 sets of writing prompts as well as all the checklists and posters you saw today. And this is our labeling unit, great for setting your students up for success like we chatted about earlier, followed by our listing unit, just more experience to practice with writing in ways that give kids confidence. All of these can be found in our TPT store or our website shop using the links below.
There we go. So if you need to get in touch with me, my email is there, the website is there, and our TPT shop is there. Hopefully that was helpful in just some new ideas to refresh writing and how to teach writing sentences in a way that makes sense to our young students. Like I said, it is super, super difficult. So give them and yourself some grace because these expectations are mind-boggling for young kids.
Thanks so much for attending. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming workshops.